So in this lesson, we're going to have a look at the philosophical foundations of Stoicism. Really, what influenced Stoicism and what influenced the people to start to develop Stoicism, and really, where can we trace the history, really, of its development. So specifically in this lesson, we're going to look at a number of different philosophical foundations which built up the so-called philosophy of Stoicism. We're going to look at things like Platonism, Cynicism, and Skepticism. These are the sort of three of the main ideas that were sort of fumbling around in classical Athens and Hellenistic Athens, okay, which came slightly after the classical period, okay? And then we're going to have a look at really how these philosophies came together to really form what we understand Stoicism to be today. So really, what is Stoicism? Well, put simply, Stoicism is what is known as a Hellenistic eudaimonic philosophy. Because we can define Stoicism in this kind of way, we can expect it to be influenced by its immediate predecessors and its contemporaries, because the definition is quite broad. Okay, the Hellenistic refers to the period in ancient Greece when it was made, or when it sort of first founded, and eudaimonic refers to the kind of type of philosophy that it is. We're going to talk about eudaimonia later on. Not only was Stoicism influenced by contemporary theories, so contemporary as in the theories around the sort of Hellenistic period at the time, they were also in conflict with these issues. They were a school of their own that would argue and debate with the other thinkers at that time. So, for example, the Socratic issues, the academic philosophies of Plato and Platonism, the Aristotelian philosophies of the peripatetic school. It's very hard to pronounce some of these words. We're going to be finding that out quite a lot in this course. So these are the kind of different kinds of people that were influenced and were influencing the ideas behind Stoicism. So we've said that Stoicism is a Hellenistic eudaimonic philosophy, but what do we really mean by this? So when we come to talk about eudaimonia itself, the most modern translations of eudaimonia sort of describe its meaning as, like, say, happiness. Okay, so in reality, the term eudaimonia roughly translates to a life worth living. And according to the philosophies of the Greco-Roman Empire era, eudaimonia can be defined sort of in part by having so-called excellent values and excellent virtues. And this is the theory that is credited to Aristotle himself, and this is the idea of virtue ethics or virtue theory. And virtue ethics is closely linked with the so-called Aristotelian ethics. And the principle of eudaimonia is popular in most of the sort of Greco-Roman theories of philosophy. So it makes sense to explain Stoicism as a part of this kind of eudaimonic kind of movement, shall we say, within the ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So, as you've seen here, like, Stoicism is quite difficult to formally define, and it's for this reason that we should understand Stoicism by looking at the comparing and contrasting with its contemporaries, trying to find out where it fits and where it did fit within ancient society, to then start to develop our understanding of it further and further as we carry on. So, for example, people like Socrates, who weren't Stoics, is famous for arguing that virtues are the only good, that the virtue is the only good that can come from a people. Okay, so really anything that isn't a virtue is neither good or bad. It's got sign of no moral worth. So these things were theories and ideas that are not just unique to Stoicism, but have developed through hundreds of years, really, through the ancient Greek period. Aristotle, on the other hand, who came after Socrates, suggested that virtues were necessary, but they were not sufficient for eudaimonia. Okay, so you need virtues to be able to have this sort of happy life worth living. Okay, but they weren't sufficient for such a life worth living. And then we look at things like Cynicism, which was a movement within itself. So cynicism sits as an extreme contrast to Aristotle. The Cynics thought that not only that virtue was the only good, but that any additional goods that Aristotle talked about were actually just distractions and needed to be, positively avoided. The philosophy of cynicism can be described quite comedically in the story of Diogenes of Sinope. Okay, so this is the kind of ideas of cynicism. I'm going to read the quote specifically. So, one day, observing a child drinking out of his hands, he casts away the cup from his wallet, and with his words he says, "A child has beaten me in plainness of living." Okay, now this is the kind of thing that Diogenes is known for. So if you want to sort of Google and research a little bit about Diogenes of Sinope, he was a very interesting character, and he really built this idea of cynicism and the Cynics around this sort of strange way of life that he sort of developed. We can explain the sort of Cynic criticism of Aristotle by suggesting that Aristotle's philosophy was a bit too aristocratic, which is what the Cynics argued that it was. They suggest that if one doesn't have certain privileges, one cannot achieve eudaimonia. This was the Aristotelian view. And the Cynics disagreed with this idea and suggested that eudaimonia can be achieved with more minimalism, discarding material value, anything with material wealth, anything with material value, that isn't actually what is part of the eudaimonia. You don't need that. And in fact, that to positively avoid that is what's going to get you to achieve this end. So what does this debate say about Stoicism? That's what's important. And Stoicism is seen as a kind of thought that there were value in both of these schools of thought. The Stoics believed that Aristotle was onto something, but that also the Cynics were. And what the Stoics tried to do was to strike a balance between the two schools of thought. They endorsed two crucial ideas, the Stoics. The one idea is that virtue is the only true good, and that other things like health, education, and wealth may be rationally preferred over sickness, ignorance, and poverty. So they just think that we can prefer these things over, ignorance and sickness, just as long as we don't think that they are valuable in themselves. So this is what the Stoics tried to believe. They believed that virtue was the only thing that was good, that health wasn't good, education wasn't good, wealth isn't good, okay? And that ignorance and poverty aren't bad. They had no kind of moral or good or bad property. That the only thing that was good was virtue. But they also argued that, unlike the Cynics, they argued that despite the fact that these things don't have any sign of good or bad value, doesn't mean we shouldn't prefer rationally, one over the other. So we shouldn't prefer. We should prefer health and education over sickness and ignorance, for example. So these are the kinds of things that the Stoics believed, and it's sort of seen as a middle way between the Aristotelian view of virtue being the only good, and also the cynical view that if virtue is the only good, then none of these things matter. So as a discussion question for this lesson, I want you to just look at this quite formal essay kind of question. And it basically asks, Stoicism successfully provides a middle ground between cynicism and Aristotelianism. Discuss. So if you want to discuss, there are some further readings in the projects section. I might do a further readings for each lesson, which might be quite useful to reading up on this and seeing really where the strengths and the weaknesses of both of these schools of thought really came about, and how Stoicism is successful in providing a middle ground between the two. In the next lesson, we're going to look specifically at Stoic philosophers themselves, and we're talking specifically about Greek Stoicism, and then we're going to move on to Roman Stoicism as we sort of carry on through the course.